Some stories from World War II were never meant to be told. Hidden battles, forgotten heroes, moments history almost erased. Real stories, no myths, only history.
March 1968. Quezon Combat Base, near the Laotian border. For 77 straight days, the Marines inside the perimeter had been living under one of the most intense bombardments of the Vietnam War. North Vietnamese artillery had turned the surrounding hills into a ring of fire. Every few minutes, another shell slammed into the base, tearing open bunkers, shredding sandbags, and throwing mud across the runway that kept the entire garrison alive. More than 6,000 Marines and soldiers were trapped inside the combat base. Outside the wire waited nearly 3 full North Vietnamese divisions. Some estimates put the number at over 20,000 troops slowly tightening a noose around the American position. At night, the bombardment would stop. That was the moment everyone feared most, because when the artillery fell silent, the sappers started moving. North Vietnamese assault teams crawled through the jungle and elephant grass toward the perimeter wire. They carried Bangalore torpedoes, satchel charges, and AK-47 rifles wrapped in cloth to keep them from rattling. Their job was simple: blow a hole in the wire, get inside the base, and kill every Marine they could reach before the defenders could react. On one of those nights, movement appeared just beyond the perimeter. A Marine in a fighting hole shouted into the darkness. Another flare shot into the sky, turning the jungle white for a few seconds. Dozens of figures were already sprinting forward. Machine guns opened up along the line. M60s hammered the darkness. M16 rifles flashed from the trenches, but the attackers kept coming. Someone shouted for artillery support, but artillery took time. Coordinates had to be confirmed. A fire mission had to be approved. Guns had to be laid on target. The Marines needed something that could respond immediately. Right behind the defensive line, a tracked vehicle roared to life. Its engine growled like a tank, but the turret looked nothing like one.
2 long barrels lifted toward the jungle. Inside the open turret, the gunner wrapped both hands around a pair of metal triggers. He squeezed. The night exploded. Twin 40mm cannons opened fire at nearly 240 rounds per minute. Every 5th shell carried a glowing tracer, turning the darkness into 2 blazing rivers of fire stretching straight into the jungle. In less than 60 seconds, more than 100 high-explosive shells slammed into the tree line. Each one weighed nearly 5 pounds. Each one detonated with enough force to shred everything within 50 meters. The explosions didn't wait for the ground. The shells touched leaves, branches, vines, and they detonated instantly. Above the attackers, instead of striking the earth, the rounds burst in the canopy, spraying steel fragments and splintered wood straight downward like a storm of knives. Men who had been charging toward the perimeter simply disappeared inside the blasts. When the gunner finally released the triggers, the jungle in front of the Marines looked like it had been hit by a hurricane made of explosions. Nothing moved. Not soldiers, not trees, not even the soil. The weapon that had just saved the entire section of the perimeter wasn't new. It wasn't experimental. And it definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Just 5 years earlier, the United States Army had officially declared the machine obsolete. They didn't upgrade it. They didn't redesign it. They didn't even try to find another use for it. They simply removed it from active service and parked hundreds of them in National Guard storage yards across the United States. The military believed the weapon belonged to a different era, an era before supersonic jets, before guided missiles, before modern air defense systems. By the early 1960s, the Army had decided that the future of anti-aircraft warfare belonged to radar-guided missile batteries like the Hawk system. Compared to that technology, the old gun platform looked primitive.
2 manually aimed cannons. No radar. No targeting computer. Just a gunner staring through optical sights and pulling triggers. Against a modern fighter jet moving faster than the speed of sound, the system had almost no chance of hitting anything. Trying to shoot down a supersonic aircraft with those guns was like trying to hit a rifle bullet with a tennis racket. So, in 1963, the Army retired the vehicle completely. Hundreds of them were shipped to storage depots. They sat under open skies. Rain filled their turrets. Birds nested in the barrels. Paint peeled. Rust spread across the steel hulls. The military machine that had once been designed to defend armored divisions from enemy aircraft was now little more than scrap metal on tracks. For several years, nobody gave it another thought. But wars have a habit of ignoring military plans. And by 1965, the United States was sliding deeper and deeper into a completely different kind of conflict. The jungles of Vietnam. It was a war the weapon had never been designed for. And within a few months, the U.S. Army would discover something strange. The system they had thrown away might be exactly the weapon they desperately needed.
By the late years of the Vietnam War, the strange story of the M42 Duster had become something of a quiet legend among the infantry units that depended on it. Officially, it was still classified as an air defense system. On paper, its job was to shoot down aircraft. In reality, most of the men who climbed into those open turrets never saw a single enemy plane during their entire deployment. What they faced instead came from the ground. Ambushes on jungle roads, night assaults against isolated fire bases, sapper teams crawling toward perimeter wire in the darkness. And every time one of those attacks began, the same pattern repeated itself. Infantry radios crackled, someone called for support, and somewhere nearby, the steel tracks of a Duster began to move. The crews knew exactly what they were driving into. The vehicle had almost no armor by the standards of Vietnam combat. The turret was completely open to the sky. The hull could barely stop rifle fire, let alone rocket-propelled grenades. Against a B-40 rocket or a mortar shell, the Duster offered almost no protection. Crews tried to improvise. They stacked sandbags around the turret walls. They welded scrap metal plates to the sides of the vehicle. Some even mounted extra machine guns wherever they could find space. None of it really solved the problem. If the enemy managed to hit the vehicle directly, the outcome was usually the same. The vehicle burned,
and the men inside rarely had time to escape. That was why the crews themselves gave the machine a second nickname. The infantry called it the Fire Dragon. The men who operated it called it something else, the Iron Coffin. Yet despite the risks, the crews kept climbing into those open turrets every day, because when the shooting started, the Duster could do something almost no other weapon in Vietnam could match. It could stop an assault immediately. Artillery was powerful, but it required coordination and approval.
Air support was devastating, but jets needed time to reach the battlefield. The Duster needed only one thing: a gunner pulling the triggers. In seconds, twin Bofors cannons could turn a jungle tree line into a wall of explosions. Entire assault waves could disappear in the span of a few bursts, and over time, the enemy learned to respect it. Captured North Vietnamese documents revealed something remarkable. Field commanders were giving specific instructions to their troops. Avoid positions where the Fire Dragon operates. In other words, if intelligence reports suggested that an American unit had Dusters nearby, attacking that sector was no longer considered worth the cost. For a weapon that the U.S. Army had once declared obsolete, that kind of reputation was extraordinary. But the story of the Duster also carried a quieter, darker truth. The men who operated it were rarely recognized for what they were doing. Technically, they belonged to the Air Defense Artillery branch. Their job description had nothing to do with frontline combat. They were not classified as tank crews. They were not classified as infantry. And because of that, many of the battles they fought simply didn't fit into the military's traditional system for recognition. The infantry units they protected often received the headlines. The Duster crews usually received a line or two in an after-action report. But there was one moment when the sacrifice of those crews could not be ignored. March 1970. Near a place called K. Joe Bridge, a Duster crew from Sea Battery, 1st Battalion, 44th Artillery, was defending the crossing when North Vietnamese sappers launched an attack on the position. In the chaos of the firefight, an enemy grenade landed inside the open turret, right in the middle of the crew. There was no time to throw it away, no time to run. Sergeant Mitchell Stout reacted instantly. He threw himself on top of the grenade. The explosion killed him immediately. But the 3 other men in the turret survived. For that action, Mitchell Stout received the Medal of Honor. It became the only Medal of Honor awarded to a soldier from the Air Defense Artillery branch during the Vietnam War. A man whose unit had been designed to fight aircraft ended up dying while defending a bridge against infantry, in a vehicle the Army had never intended for that kind of battle. By 1971, the American Duster battalions began leaving Vietnam. Some of the vehicles were transferred to South Vietnamese forces. Others were simply retired again. By the time the war ended, the Duster had fired an estimated 4 million rounds of 40mm ammunition in combat, not against aircraft, against jungle positions, ambush sites, and attacking infantry. Roughly 200 Duster crewmen were killed during the war. Many more carried the scars with them for the rest of their lives. And yet, today, the weapon remains one of the least discussed systems of the entire conflict.
Histories of the Vietnam War usually focus on helicopters, fighter jets, or famous infantry battles. The Duster rarely gets more than a passing mention. But ask the soldiers and Marines who fought on those fire bases and convoy routes. The men who watched the jungle light up when those twin cannons opened fire. Many of them will tell you the same thing. When the perimeter started moving in the dark, when the radio calls turned desperate, when it looked like the enemy might finally break through, there was one machine they hoped would arrive. A strange, outdated gun system from the 1950s. A weapon the Army had once decided it didn't need. The M42 Duster. The Fire Dragon. Possibly the most important weapon of the Vietnam War that almost nobody remembers today.